Welcome to Epi Research Seminar and welcome to Mark. It's really nice to see all of you on this sunny morning. Today we have a fantastic seminar speaker. It feels kind of funny to introduce Jim because so many of us know him and are really familiar with him. He is one of the backbones of our WBOB community. As you know, Jim is a chronic disease epidemiologist. He studies cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and other conditions of aging. He's also a WBOB alum, having received his PhD here in epidemiology back in the 1900s. His first faculty position as an assistant professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in their School of Public Health, and then returned to our WBOB and is now a professor here in our division. He has multiple leadership roles here, including being the field center PI for both MESA and the chief, and directing the T32 training grant in cardiovascular disease epidemiology and prevention. I've been really looking forward to the seminar because I remember talking to Jim about Achieve when it was launched 5 or 6 years ago and thinking, wow, I wonder what's going to happen with that. Been waiting to find out, and so today we get to find out. So thank you so much, Jim. But first, I need to give you the special seminar present.
Thank you so much. All right, and Katie, do I win the award for longest title for a seminar this year?
And next week is the shorts.
All right, so on some background, how I ended up working on the study randomized trial of hearing aids. So those of us who are aging may eventually reach a point where we have to deal with some common age-related sensory impairments. These include hearing loss, olfactory loss, cataracts, and reduced contrast sensitivity. This is a condition that makes it more difficult to see in the dark, so people have trouble driving at night. Focusing more specifically on hearing loss, what is this? This is the result of progressive damage to the cellular structures of the cochlea from noise, aging, and other factors. It's typically assessed through the skull.
You don't have hearing loss. It's just constant batteries charge.
All right, typically assessed through a formal audiological examination conducted by an audiologist. And so on the left-hand side here, we have a picture of an audiogram that was taken from an examination. And so basically the patient is presented with tones of different frequencies, and they indicate whether or not they can hear the tone. And so a common way to then assess hearing loss is through a pure tone average, which is basically the decibels obtained through an audiogram at 0.5, 2, and 4 kilohertz. And that's in the yellow box here in the middle. So if you took a pure tone average for this person, they would probably fall in the mild hearing loss range, which is 20 to 40 decibels, 40 to 70, reflecting moderate hearing loss. On the right-hand side, we have a graph showing the prevalence of hearing loss. This is based on a definition of more than 25 decibels for a pure tone average. These are data from the NHANES study, which measured hearing loss 2001 to 2008. And you see that the prevalence starts to increase around age 40, and by age 80 and above, the prevalence is approaching 80%. So it's a very common condition of older age. When I think about epidemiologic studies of hearing loss, really one of the groundbreaking studies was conducted at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This research was initially begun by Ron and Barbara Klein, and they went to a small city, Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, which is northeast of Madison, and started a population-based cohort study there. I forget the exact number, but they had a specific age range for eligibility, and they managed to get 80% of the people in this city enrolled in their cohort study back in the late 80s. Their colleague, Karen Cruikshanks, built on this infrastructure and started the epidemiology of hearing loss study. She added hearing, olfaction, cognitive function to the data collection. And then later, she recruited the children of this cohort into the Beaver Dam Offspring Study, or BOSS. And at this point, she contacted me. She was looking for a cardiovascular disease epidemiologist to serve as a collaborator and a consultant. So this was my first opportunity to sort of get involved in the sensory impairment world. Karen has since retired, and the project is now being run by Natasha Merton. So this figure shows some data from one of the publications from this project in Beaver Dam. And this is leveraging the long-term follow-up that exists, as well as the multi-generational design. And so specifically focused on birth cohort effects or hearing loss. And so what you see here are prevalences on the x-axis and birth cohorts on the, prevalences on the y-axis, birth cohorts on the x-axis. One of the things you see is the prevalence being higher for men than women in these generations, but also a declining prevalence across the birth cohorts. And a formal analysis found that the prevalence of hearing impairment has been declining in more recent birth cohorts. So this is good news that this sort of trend is happening. This is another publication from the Beaver Dam projects led by Mary Fisher, looking at different sensory impairments and whether they predict 10-year risk of cognitive impairment. So hearing impairment, vision impairment, olfactory impairment. So in the multivariable adjusted models that you see there on the right, adjusted for all the long list of things in the footnote here, hearing impairment was associated with about a twofold higher risk of cognitive impairment over 10 years. Vision impairment about the same relative risk, and olfactory impairment about a fourfold increased risk of cognitive impairment. So these are really interesting findings, but these are observational data, and you all know observational data, there are concerns about confounding and bias. And so what explains these associations, specifically thinking about hearing loss and cognitive decline? So one possible explanation on the right is that there's a causal connection, that there's some causal mechanism that links hearing loss to cognitive decline. On the right-hand side, there are some alternative explanations. There could be shared risk factors. This is, classic confounding, shared risk factors for hearing loss and cognitive decline. It could be that underlying vascular disease independently leads to hearing loss and cognitive decline. Or at the bottom here, it could be that there's some reverse causality, that cognitive decline leads to hearing loss. And this is plausible because the sounds that are encoded in the peripheral audiological system have to be then decoded in the brain. And so this could be certainly a plausible mechanism. The Lancet Journal convened a commission of experts to look at risk factors, among other things, risk factors for dementia. They published a comprehensive report back in 2020, and they took a deep dive into the literature, mostly observational data on risk factors for dementia. And as part of this, assuming causality, they did some estimates. These are basically very sophisticated population attributable risk estimates for various risk factors. And they found that taken together, modifiable risk factors could potentially account for 40% of dementia cases. Interestingly, though, in this report, they found that hearing loss in mid to late life was the single largest potentially modifiable risk factor for dementia at 8% here in this figure. So in thinking about these various potential risk factors for dementia that are modifiable, some of course are more easily addressable than others, and wanted to point out that hearing loss, as I showed earlier, is highly prevalent. It's treatable in late life with existing interventions, hearing aids basically, that are underused. And intervention is relatively risk-free. There's not a lot of risk entailed with prescribing hearing aids. Now, what does the literature say about use of hearing aids and cognitive decline? There's some literature on this, and in fact, there was a meta-analysis published last year that involved 8 different studies. This is one of those studies. These are data taken from a smaller study that was done in conjunction with the ARIC study and the ARIC neurocognitive study. These are data just from the Washington County site of ARIC. You can see the numbers are relatively small. So comparing 43 hearing aid users to 42 non-users, these are all people who have moderate to severe hearing impairment. In over 20 years, you can see in both groups, there was a decline in their global cognitive test scores. But these declines, the rate of decline was less in the hearing aid users compared to the non-users, and a statistically significant difference despite the relatively small sample sizes. So these are, intriguing data, again, observational in nature. You still wonder about whether there's confounding, because the hearing aid users in this study and many other studies tend to be of higher socioeconomic status and have fewer kind of health concerns. So thinking about potential mechanisms, what are the mechanisms that could link hearing loss to cognitive decline and dementia? I'm going to mention 3. The first one is something called cognitive load. So here the idea is it takes brain effort basically to process sound, and if someone has degraded sound because of hearing loss, that may require a sort of greater cognitive load to process that sound, leaving less resources for other things like memory and executive function. A second possibility is that hearing loss could lead to changes in brain structure and function, and there's some evidence for this, that individuals with hearing loss may have different brain volumes, brain structure. And then the third possibility is social isolation. So individuals who have communication challenges may become more socially isolated, more lonely, and this could be an important factor in cognitive decline and dementia. So about 10 years ago, Frank Lin, who directs the Cochlear Center at Johns Hopkins, and Joe Koresh, who's the PI of the ARIC neurocognitive study, started having some discussions about this particular issue of hearing loss and dementia, and started asking whether it would be feasible to do a randomized trial testing these possible associations. And in fact, pointing out that the hearing loss intervention, if these different mechanisms could be are in play, could basically disrupt all 3 of these potential mechanisms. So eventually they formed the Achieve Collaborative Research Group, which involves investigators at these 8 institutions. And the picture in the middle was taken in 2017 when we were gathering in Chapel Hill. This was a time when the staff for the Achieve study were undergoing central training. So the underlying question that we were trying to address in the Achieve study was, can treating hearing loss reduce cognitive decline over 3 years in older adults with hearing loss, but with without substantial cognitive impairment. This is really the first of its kind. There's no other study like this that's been conducted. And so sort of breaking new ground in that sense. Next, going to talk a little bit about the study design and the cohort that was enrolled. So the ACHIEVE study is also unique in that it was built on the scientific and physical infrastructure of an existing prospective cohort study, an observational study, and this was the Atherosclerosis Risk and Community Study, or ARIC. And as most of you know, ARIC is an ongoing longitudinal observational study of 15,792 adults who were originally 45 to 64 in 1987 to 89, and from the 4 communities shown here in the map. So the ACHIEVE set out to recruit participants from ARIC, and because they had been part of this long-term study, we already had quite a bit of information and some sense of who would be eligible for the trial and who wouldn't. And then in these same 4 communities, ACHIEVE set out to recruit new volunteers outside of ARIC. This slide shows the main inclusion and exclusion criteria. So there are a number of them. I just wanted to highlight a few. So participants had to be 70 to 84. They had to be, in a sense, or not have cognitive impairment, and this was assessed through a mini mental state examination score of either 23 or 25 and above. They had to have untreated hearing loss, meaning they had not used hearing aids in the year before recruitment. And their pure tone average had to fall between this 30 and 70 range, or within this 30 to 70 range, which, if you remember, constitutes either mild or moderate hearing loss. So in the design, at the end of the day, 238 participants were recruited out of the ARIC study, and another 739 were recruited de novo from the community. So a total of 977 participants. The original recruitment goal was 850, so we managed to go above that. Once participants were enrolled and randomized, they were randomized into either a hearing intervention arm, which involved audiological counseling and provision of hearing aids, or a successful aging health education control arm, which involves sessions with a health educator. So all of that, the recruitment, randomization, and the intervention sessions occurred between 2018 and 2019. And then we followed the participants every 6 months between 2018 and 2021, and then conducted final 3-year exams between 2021 and 2022. Should mention that everyone in the successful aging control arm at the end of their 3-year exam was offered the hearing intervention. So they could get the hearing aids too, they just had to postpone it for 3 years. Yes.
The hearing intervention didn't get the successful aging health education. Like they didn't get any.
So during this 3-year period, the hearing intervention group did not also get the successful aging program, although they were also offered that at the end of their 3-year exam if they wanted it. Yes, Russell.
Jim, there's a wide variety of hearing aids from $100 to thousands and thousands of dollars. What did you provide here?
So these were relatively high-end. Sonia, I don't know if you know the
as far as I've been told.
I don't know if you know the retail price. I think they're around $3,000 per pair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
$3,000
for a pair.
Sorry to. Given $3,000 a pair, that's an expense, pretty big expense for subjects. Why didn't you do 14% over your target? Yeah.
So we were motoring along, reaching the target. This study, like most clinical trials, has a data and safety monitoring board, and so they were approached about this, and they actually recommended, since we were doing pretty well on recruitment, and they, there's some power calculations, of course, but they they had some concerns that there was some fudginess about that, and so they wanted us to go a little bit higher just to ensure that there would be adequate power.
Fantastic. Thanks.
So this slide shows the progress of recruitment here at the University of Minnesota. Again, we were working between 2018 and 2019. The green line shows the number of participants who were pre-screened, and so pre-screening involved a telephone call in which a number of questions were asked to determine eligibility. So we did about 800 of those. The yellow line indicates a screening exam. So these were where the participant came into our clinic and we put them through some additional procedures and tests. The most important of which probably was the sort of formal audiological exam with an audiologist to determine whether they met our inclusion criteria for mild to moderate hearing loss. So we did about 650 of those. And ultimately we enrolled 236 here at Minnesota who were randomized. This is the breakdown of our local recruitment, 43 ultimately coming out of the ARIC cohort and another 193 de novo. We asked the participants how they came to learn about the study, and that's what's shown here on the table on the right. So we sent out some mass mailings to individuals who are 70 to 84, just a letter in the mail inviting them to be in the study. So that was our most successful source. We also posted on bulletin boards in senior living complexes, as well as video boards at some outpatient clinics. Word of mouth was an important source for us, either through the participants themselves or our staff. We got smaller numbers through a retiree newsletter, our study website, and a booth at the state fair. A bit more on the interventions themselves. So again, eligible participants were randomized in a 1-to-1 ratio to either the hearing intervention or the health education control arm. This was a permuted block design, stratified by severity of hearing loss, recruitment source, either ARIC or de novo, and field site. So those who were randomized to the hearing intervention went through a best practices hearing intervention that was led by an audiologist. This involved 4 sessions of about an hour each, spread apart by 1 to 3 weeks, in which they received hearing loss education, hearing aids, and related technologies. After that, during the follow-up period, they continued to receive booster sessions from the audiologist. On the health education control side, if someone was randomized to that group, they participated in an established program called the 10 Keys to Successful Aging or Healthy Aging to promote understanding of key health topics. So this involved 4 sessions of about an hour each with a certified health educator. Again, these were about 1 to 3 weeks apart. And then during the follow-up period, additional booster sessions. So the control arm here was basically designed to provide the same degree of attention and time with our staff compared to the hearing intervention. This slide shows a comparison of some baseline characteristics according to which group folks are randomized to. So this is basically assessing whether the randomization worked. You would expect to see balance between the groups, and we more or less see that. On average, participants were about 76, 77 years of age. About 53, 54% were female. 11 or 12% were self-identified Black race. In terms of education, about half had some level of college education. The pure tone average here was around 39 or 40. That puts them kind of at the border of mild, between mild and moderate hearing loss. Now, some of you may have been thinking
What would the pure tone be for normal hearing?
normal hearing, pure tone average is less than 20. Now, some of you may have been thinking with this time frame, we had COVID in this time frame, and that's certainly true. And I can't emphasize how fortunate we were with the timing of this trial and when COVID occurred. So remember, we were recruiting and randomizing between 2018 and 2019. So the last participant was randomized towards the end of 2019. Those 4 intervention sessions were then occurring and completed early in 2020. And then March 2020, all of our clinics had to shut down. And we were shut down for 15 months. And during that time, our study procedures had to be adapted for phone-based intervention visits as well as outcome assessments. We were able to reopen our clinics in June of 2021. And that was about the time that we were scheduled to begin our final 3-year examinations. So at the end of the day, we were able to complete baseline assessments, the initial study interventions, as well as our final 3-year assessments outside of this clinic closure period, which was just so fortunate.
So you had booster sessions during the COVID period, basically.
We had booster sessions during the COVID period. They had to be delivered by phone by either the health educator or the audiologist. There were some, there are always some issues with hearing aids of them breaking or having issues. So we had to be somewhat creative with that in passing off devices so our audiologists could fix them, but being socially distanced and safe.
Sorry, Jim. Just curious. Telephones are hearing devices for a hearing study. Did you consider doing Zoom or visual instead, or why did you land on hearing? Is it just easier?
So we did some pilot testing of using a tablet device to deliver interventions or do visits. In the end, we ended up not really taking advantage of that. I think with this older population, a lot of them were not very technologically savvy. They were more comfortable with the phone. And I'll talk about this when we get to data analysis, but a lot of the data that was collected during this COVID shutdown period did not contribute, or really did not contribute to our final primary analyses, at least.
Yes.
All right, now some information, some results on hearing intervention engagement. So these are basically histograms, but turned on their side. The y-axis are numbers of hours self-reported of hearing aid use by the participants in the hearing intervention arm of the trial. The x-axis are percentages. And these data were collected 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years after randomization. So if we just look at the 6-month time point, you see that there's quite a spread, a range. So some participants were reporting 18 hours of hearing aid use in a day on average. Some participants, basically none. And the median shown in green was 10 hours per day. At 1 year, this dropped down to 8 hours per day median. And then at 2 and 3 years, it was 7 hours per day. So at least self-reported here indication that participants were using the hearing aids, but quite a bit of variability. We asked participants some questions about their satisfaction with the hearing aids. And so a question, how has a hearing aid changed your enjoyment of life? 43% said very much better, 41% quite a lot better, 13% slightly better, 3% no change. Also a question, do you think a hearing aid is worth the trouble? 74% said very much worth it, 19% quite a lot, 6% moderately, 1% slightly. So participants in this arm of the trial seemed to be quite satisfied with the intervention they were provided. Next, I'm going to show you some results from an instrument called the Hearing Handicap Inventory. This is a 10-item instrument that was collected at these same time points. And the figure on the left shows the hearing handicap inventory score. And then the x-axis is years from randomization. A score of 10 or above indicates moderate challenges with communication function. Anything 8 or below or 10 or below actually is more normal communication function. So you see both groups, the control arm and the hearing intervention arm at baseline, were in this moderate hearing handicap category, roughly about 16, score of 16. And then right away at 6 months, the intervention arm, the hearing intervention arm dropped down below 10 and stayed below 10 for the rest of the study. And this gap between the control and intervention arms persisted throughout the study. On the right-hand side is just a forest plot with the same data showing the difference between the two groups was about 9.3 points on this scale.
So this inventory was administered over the phone.
During the
COVID.
COVID period, it had to be administered over the phone, yes. I'm next going to move on to some of the pre-specified outcomes. So one of these was loneliness. This was assessed through a 20-item UCLA loneliness scale, which included questions about relational connectedness, social connectedness, and perceived isolation. The range of scores is 20 to 80, and higher scores indicate something worse, more loneliness. So a score of 20 to 34 would be classified as no or low loneliness, 35 to 49, moderate loneliness. So if we look at the results from the 3 years of the trial, at baseline, the participants had scores of around 33. So this was just a little bit below moderate, the threshold for moderate loneliness. And we start to see a separation between the two groups, with the control arm showing higher loneliness scores during the follow-up compared to the intervention arm. When we stratify by the two recruitment sources, we see that there's more of a separation on this loneliness scale between the control and intervention arms in the de novo group compared to the ARIC group. Next, I want to show you some results for social network characteristics. This was assessed through a Cohen social network index, which measures the number of individuals and social roles a participant has regular contact with, and regular contact is defined as at least once every 2 weeks. So one of the measures here was just social network size. It's just a count of the total number of people participant has contact with. The other is a social network diversity, which takes into account the different roles that people may have, whether they're family, friends, or other roles. So here for social network size, we see at baseline, the participants were around 22. And then we have a separation between the control and intervention groups, where the intervention group is reporting a larger social network size during the follow-up period compared to the control group. We do see a decline in this social network size in both groups, and I attribute this mainly to COVID, the social isolation that was occurring kind of starting at year 1 for these participants. When we compare the ARIC and de novo recruitment sources, similar to the pattern we saw for the loneliness scale, we see more separation with the de novo group compared to the ARIC group. In terms of social network diversity, at baseline, both groups were around 6 on this scale. And then we see a separation between the intervention and the control arms, in which the intervention group is reporting a more diverse social network during the follow-up. And again, this kind of decline in year 1, 2, and 3, probably COVID related. When comparing the ARIC and de novo recruitment sources, again, it's the de novo group that's showing more separation on this scale. All right, and then on to the cognitive outcomes, which are the really the main reason this study was conceived and implemented. So Achieve used a comprehensive neurocognitive battery. This was built on the same battery that was being used in the ARIC neurocognitive study. It includes 10 different components shown here. One thing that I wanted to point out was, and this gets back to Simon's comment, this is a study of people with mild to moderate hearing loss. So you do have concerns if you're administering tests through a neurocognitive battery that people are understanding the directions and following along. And so as part of this protocol, there was a verification of speech understanding, kind of a standardized approach to make sure that participants, before they underwent the battery, that they were understanding speech and could undergo the cognitive test administration. So these 10 components were then combined through a factor score into a measure of global cognition. And this is the primary outcome for the trial, this factor score of global cognition. In addition, 3 tests each were used to compute factor scores for 3 different cognitive domains. These are memory, executive function, and language. So these cognitive domains are secondary outcomes for the trial. And lastly, change over time for analysis was converted to standard deviation units relative to baseline. So when you see results, you can think of it in that way. So more on the statistical analysis. So as I mentioned, the outcomes are changes in the cognitive factor scores between baseline and year 3. So not including the year 1 or year 2 sort of interim measures in that. If missing, year 3 cognitive scores and covariates were imputed using multiple imputation by chain equations. And then the year 1 or 2 in-person data were only used if someone died prior to year 3. So that was a relatively small number of people.
So
Yes.
if they didn't have year 3, how were they imputed, based on year 1 or 2 or based on baseline?
They were imputed based on earlier data, which could potentially include some of the interim years. Yeah. All right. Main analysis was intention to treat analysis. All the students here should know what that means. Here we're comparing those randomized to hearing intervention versus those randomized to the control intervention. So people remained in their randomization group. And we did have so-called drop-ins. So drop-ins in this context would be people who were randomized to the control arm, the health education arm, who went out on their own, apart from the trial, and purchased hearing aids. And we had people like that. So if that happened, if someone went out and purchased hearing aids on their own outside of the trial, for this intention to treat analysis, they remained in that group, the healthy education group, the control arm, as part of the analysis. Analysis was done through mixed effects models that adjusted for baseline hearing, recruitment source, field site, age, sex, education, presence of ApoE epsilon 4 alleles, which is a major genetic risk factor for dementia, and covariate times time interactions. There were a number of sensitivity analyses that were pre-specified in the protocol. And those of you that conduct clinical trials probably know better than me. They're very strict about analysis plans. So you have to register your analysis plans ahead of time. They're reviewed by the Data and Safety Monitoring Board and vetted by them. And if you make changes to the analysis plan, and we had to because of COVID disruptions, that also has to be reviewed and approved by the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. So in this protocol, there was a pre-specified sensitivity analysis, among others, that specified stratification by recruitment source, either ARIC or de novo. All right, so here are the primary results in terms of our global cognition factor score. So in this figure on the y-axis, that's the global cognition factor score. And on the x-axis, years from randomization, you see just the 2 time points here, baseline and year 3. Control arm in blue and the intervention arm in red. We see in both groups some decline in the global cognition factor score over the 3 years of follow-up. These are about as parallel lines as you can draw, right? No association here with the primary outcome in the whole group. However, in the stratified analysis that I mentioned, we see a slightly different picture. So on the far right are the de novo participants. Again, not much difference between the 2 groups in the rate of cognitive decline over the 3 years. In the ARIC group in the middle, which is smaller, we see a steeper rate of cognitive decline on average in the control arm compared to the intervention arm. And this was a statistically significant difference, at least at the nominal level of 0.05 in this group. These are the same data now represented in a forest plot. So the forest plot in the middle, total group at the top, ARIC in the middle, de novo at the bottom. On the left-hand side of the plot would be estimates that favor the control arm of the control intervention arm. On the right-hand side would be results that favor the hearing intervention. And so in the ARIC group, indicated here in red, we see a result that favors the intervention. If you look at the point estimates, the difference in the rate of cognitive decline according to the global cognition factor score, it's about a 50% difference between the 2 groups. A formal test of interaction here of the intervention times the recruitment source had a p-value of 0.01. Next, going to show you the results in the same format, but now for the 3 different domains. First one here being the language domain. We see a very similar pattern to what we saw for overall global cognition, with the ARIC group kind of standing out compared to the de novo group.
Tim, can you point out which one's about hearing? Like, is this language all written or?
Yeah, sure. So I have this on a later slide too. So there are 2 of the 10 components that involve only hearing. Those 2 are not included in the language domain. Here's the result for executive function. Pattern looks a little like what we saw before, although not statistically significant in the ARIC group. And then finally, for the memory domain, the ARIC group, again, furthest to the right in terms of a point estimate, but not statistically significant. So those are the main results. And I, throughout my career, largely worked on observational studies. So I had maybe this simplistic view that you do a trial to get clear and definitive answers. And here we are 5 years later, got the results back, and the results are far from clear and definitive. We've got this interaction through a pre-specified stratified analysis, and we're scratching our heads to try to figure out what this all means. Is this real? Why does the ARIC group stand out? And so I wanted to share some more thoughts on that. So one possibility is that the ARIC part of the study, those participants may have been better adhere to the intervention, the hearing intervention. Maybe they were wearing their hearing aids more and more often and more hours per day. In fact, the opposite is true. So if you look at the self-reported number of hours per day, it's 7.2 at year 1 in the ARIC group and 8.3 in the de novo group. And that difference persists throughout the other years of the study. So this doesn't seem like a good explanation. Another possible explanation is at the ARIC group and the de novo group, they have different characteristics. And there seems to be some truth to this. So These are some baseline characteristics, ARIC group in red, the de novo group on the right in green. Average age is 3 years older, ARIC participants 79 on average, de novo 76. Another important difference down at the bottom is income. So the ARIC participants are more likely to fall into these lower income groups. So we're starting to see a pattern here that the ARIC participants tend to have more risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia compared to the de novo group. Some other baseline characteristics, if you look at diabetes, 29% in the ARIC group, 17% in the de novo group. 36% of the ARIC participants were living alone compared to 28% for the de novo group. If you look at baseline cognition scores, and a lower score here indicates worse cognition, we see that those are lower, both in terms of global cognition and the 3 domains in the ARIC group compared to the de novo group. You've seen these figures before. I showed you these just a bit ago, but now I've taken out the intervention arm of the trial, and I'm showing you just the control groups, ARIC versus de novo on the right. And I think this kind of highlights a few things. So if you look at baseline average global cognition scores, they're lower in the ARIC group compared to the de novo group. And if you look at change over the 3 years, there's a steeper decline in the ARIC participants compared to the de novo group. The difference in the rate of change is about 3 times when comparing these 2 groups. So I think this points to a kind of healthy participant effect that was going on. So the de novo group involved individuals who are 70 to 84 who wanted to volunteer and sign up for a research study. And I think those people tend to be healthier than the general population. It's also true that the ARIC participants probably were healthier when they signed up for ARIC 30 years ago than the general population. But I think that difference, that sort of healthy participant effect, may have diminished over time, over 30 years. And so we were left with this really two different kinds of participants in the study. Is there a question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the people who went out and bought hearing aids, which were they in?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So overall, about 16% of participants who were randomized to the healthy education control arm went out on their own and got hearing aids. Those numbers were 19% in the de novo group and about 7% in the ARIC group. So the de novo participants, they had higher incomes in general, and so they probably had the means to go out and do it on their own.
In terms of missing that year, I'm still thinking about this. At year 3, like, was it like percentage different? Because I know ARIC participants are probably more compliant because.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think the differences were relatively small in terms of missingness between the 2 groups.
And compliance? Do you have any?
Let me get to that, I think, a little bit later. Okay. I want to make sure I finish.
You're fine, you're fine. I thought people were gonna ask questions. I would start handing out the mic, but.
All right, I'll wrap up. So just to summarize,
I'm not trying to rush you. I just thought we had jumped into question time all of a sudden.
just in terms of key findings, things I've shown you today, the study found high adherence to and satisfaction with hearing interventions that was sustained over 3 years. I think the clear results are around things like communication impairment, loneliness, social network size, and diversity. In terms of the primary outcome, global cognitive decline, it's much more mixed message. We found reduced cognitive decline with hearing intervention, but only in the ARIC cohort, not in the de novo cohort. It's possible, this is one interpretation, is that the slower rate of cognitive decline in the healthier de novo volunteers may have limited any potential benefits of the hearing intervention. This study, of course, has some limitations, one of which is that we couldn't mask. So it's pretty obvious when someone comes in for an in-person exam, whether or not they're wearing a hearing aid, or staff can see that. So we weren't able to mask the intervention either to the participants or the staff. There's the issue that some of these tests are auditory only, and that was a question that David brought up. And then another outcome for the study was incident cognitive impairment. And it turned out there just weren't enough events. I didn't show you those data. There weren't enough events. I think that's an underpowered part of the study, and it's likely going to require further follow-up to assess that outcome. So what's next for the study? There are analyses underway to try to better characterize and understand this interaction between intervention and recruitment source. There are manuscripts being developed and hopefully will be submitted later this year on other outcomes, including brain structure, health-related quality of life, depression, hospitalizations, physical activity and functioning, and healthcare costs. I should mention, I've seen some early results of the brain structure paper, and I have to say they're kind of interesting. There's potentially some intervention effects on brain structure. And in terms of the future of the study, we've been fortunate enough to receive some additional funding to extend follow-up now through early 2026. So this will mean between 6 and 8 years of follow-up in total for the participants. So this will allow us to assess possible longer-term effects. Most of the funding for this trial came from the National Institutes on Aging. I should mention, and this is the bullet at the bottom, that the hearing aids and related technologies and training support of study audiologists was provided in kind by Sonova Phonak through a materials transfer agreement, but they weren't involved in any of the analyses that I presented here today. Just want to acknowledge the participants. They were amazing. They stuck with us through a once in 100 years global pandemic. So that was just truly amazing. Here's a list of all of the staff that have been involved with the study since the beginning in some way or another. Just wanted to mention that we had a really great partnership with the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing on our campus. They allowed some of their audiologists to come over and work for us part-time on the study. So that was really great. And then most of the results that I presented here today were published last year in the Lancet. So here's the citation if you're interested in going out and looking at that publication. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. I see there's a lot of questions. Let's start with Abby.
That was a great talk. I'm struck by the fact that in the first sort of set of results that you showed that were not your primary outcome, that de novo groups seem to have the biggest change in a positive direction, but that you don't see any difference in that final primary outcome looking at global cognitive function for the de novo group. So I'm struck by that it seems like a discrepancy, and I'm wondering if you can explain or expand on that.
Yeah, I don't have the answers. One thing I will say is, I think that between the two groups, the de novo group was sort of in general had different motivations for entering the study. These were people who, in the data sort of bear this out, were concerned about their hearing loss and their communication issues. And so they were motivated to join a trial where they could get access to this hearing intervention and work with an audiologist and get free hearing aids. To some extent, that was probably true of the ARIC participants as well, but some of them were also motivated by other things. They were just great volunteers, like they've been in the study for 30 years. I mean, who does that? And, you know, we had, they had great rapport with the staff. So many of these participants were working with the same staff in Achieve and ARIC. And so when invited to be in another research study, they were more likely to sign up. So perhaps some of these differences that we're seeing between the two groups, particularly on those measures like social network and diversity and loneliness, reflect some of these underlying motivations and what that reflects about the people coming into the study.
What happens if you adjust those like social network type
things for people's cognitive decline.
Yeah, I don't know that that analysis has been done, but it would be an interesting additional analysis to do things.
Okay, I'm trying to give people a turn that haven't had a turn to ask a question yet, so Gracia.
Thanks, Jen, that's great. I'm just curious, in the ARIC group where you did see a statistically significant difference, let's say that that's real. I'm not familiar with these scales. How meaningful of a difference is that, considered by experts?
Just can I ask a clarifying question? So when you're talking about meaningful differences, are you talking about in terms of global cognition?
I think so, like, or any of those, like, it's like, okay, it's statistically significant, but like someone who knows these scales, like, does anybody care? Like, it's like, so what? It like, or is it big enough so that someone's like, oh, I want that, you know?
So part of the issue, of course, is when using something like a factor score, it doesn't easily translate into something you could tell a patient or physician. So I think in that sense, there's some difficulties in converting this into something that we could all understand. I think if you looked at something like this global cognition score, which has been used in the ARIC study cohort itself, it's a reasonable predictor of conversion to, say, dementia or impaired cognition. So I don't have I don't have numbers in my head that I can quote you, but
Yeah, I mean, or just
it tracks. It tracks for
a je ne
sure.
sais quoi feeling about like, oh, this, yeah, this is good.
I think the bigger problem, and you said if this is real, so let's just hypothetically say this is real, but it's only going on in this ARIC cohort. I think the real problem is what you do with that. Like a person coming in, seeing their physician, they're not going to ask them a question, have you been in an epidemiologic study for 30 years? And so you'd be a good candidate for, a hearing aid. So
Yeah.
I think these additional analyses to try to figure out what's going on here are going to be critically important if this is going to mean anything.
Okay.
And one final question from Ivan.
I'll throw two at you. One is, so you said 20% of the de novo group had gone and bought hearing aids on their own. What happens if you pull them out of the analysis? And the second question is, what are lessons learned from doing an RCT nested within cohort design?
Really good question. So first question is, what if we move away from an intention to treat analysis and analyze people into the group in which they ultimately ended up? So putting the people who went out and got hearing aids into the hearing aid group. So those results are a little bit stronger. In stronger, I mean just within the ARIC cohort, you see a larger effect size in that kind of analysis than you do in the intention to treat analysis. In the overall group, it's still not significant, even in the per protocol analysis. The second question had to do with lessons learned of nesting within an observational cohort study. A couple things I can mention. One is, I think that allowed us to get going much quicker with the study. So there were already facilities in place, in some cases staff in place. There were protocols in place that ARIC was using. And so all of that accelerated the sort of startup period for the study. The second thing is recruiting out of the ARIC cohort also was a good jumpstart because these were participants that were known at these centers and they were, super volunteers. And so to get started, that recruitment timeline, the early part of that was largely the ARIC participants. The novo part of it took longer to kick in. So those are two things that I think were important benefits of nesting within an observational study like this.
Okay, so it is a minute past 11. I know there were some questions we didn't get to, but I think we can linger for a little bit in this room if people want to, but they're going to be setting up for another meeting soon, so we can't stick around too long. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much.
Five years of my life. I went by.